So the very last thing that we'll talk about for the entire semester is plant reproduction. So the goal of this short video is just to give you a brief introduction to plant reproduction and introduce you to the concepts of gametophytes and sporophytes and the alternation of generations. So you might recall that sexual reproduction is vitally important to help create genetic recombination in offspring. So organisms who reproduce asexually, their offspring are going to be clones of them, and they are usually produced by mitosis. And so as a result, we don't get genetic variation except for rare new mutations. So with sexual reproduction, we have two parents. They're both going to produce unique gametes through the process of meiosis, and then those two gametes will come together to produce a genetically unique zygote. Now, some plants do reproduce asexually, but for the plants that reproduce sexually, how they go about reproducing sexually is very different than what we observe in animals. So in animals, we know that during sexual reproduction, parents give rise to offspring that look very much like the parent. So for example, if you have two adult cats, they're going to produce a kitten that looks very much like them. And so what we see is that we have two diploid parents. They have a subset of cells that undergo meiosis to produce egg and sperm, which are haploid. Those haploid egg and sperm will then come together in a fertilization event to produce a new diploid zygote. That zygote will undergo mitosis and eventually will become in a form that looks very much like the parents that started this whole process. What we see in plants, however, is that you can have a parent giving rise to an offspring that does not look or function like them. And in fact, they're not even the same ploidy as them. So we see it takes an additional generation to get back to the original parent form. So let's walk through this. So what we start with is what's called a sporophyte, and this is a diploid structure, which is then undergoing meiosis. Now what happens here is that we produce spores instead of egg and sperm. And so the spores are haploid. Those undergo mitosis to produce a haploid structure called a gametophyte. These mature gametophytes undergo mitosis and they end up producing the haploid egg and sperm. Then we finally have that fertilization event to rejoin the chromosomes together to get a new diploid individual, and this diploid individual is going to be that sporophyte, and then that whole cycle can start again. And so what we can see is that plants and animals are very different. So what we see in animals is when there's meiosis, we produce egg and sperm, but in plants when there's meiosis, we end up producing spores. So just to sort of walk through this again, so remember animals, two diploid parents, meiosis to produce haploid egg and sperm, fertilization to make a diploid zygote. In plants, we have a diploid sporophyte, which undergoes meiosis to produce a haploid spore. So sporophyte undergoes meiosis to make a haploid spore. Those spores are then going to grow into haploid gametophytes, which undergo mitosis to produce haploid egg and sperm. And now we're finally back at fertilization to make a diploid zygote, which is in fact going to be the new sporophyte generation. So plants have what we call the alternation of generations. We're going back and forth between this haploid gametophyte form and these diploid sporophyte forms, and they go one after the other. One gives rise to the other, and so on. And so the sporophytes are always the diploid forms, and they make those spores through meiosis, and those spores are actually really important for dispersal. Then when those spores land, they can then grow into the haploid gametophytes, and those undergo mitosis to make the gametes that will then allow for genetic recombination to happen when they come back together through fertilization to make the zygote, and then that zygote is going to make the new sporophyte generation. So what we're going to do in class is we're going to talk about how this alternation of generations works in mosses and in the flowering plants, the angiosperms.